The dust from Jack Morrison's horse had barely settled when he heard the first sharp crack of flesh meeting flesh. The sound cut through the warm Arizona evening like a gunshot, drawing his gray eyes toward the ramshackle saloon that dominated the center of Perdition Wells. Through the grimy windows, he could see shadows moving in the amber lamplight, but it was the cry that followed, high, pained, unmistakably female, that made his jaw clench and his hand drift instinctively toward the Colt. At his hip. Jack had been riding hard for 3 days, chasing the ghost of Joaquin Valdez across the territorial Badlands. The bounty on Valdez's head would set him up for months, maybe even a year if he was careful with the money. But careful had never been Jack's way with money. Every dollar he earned hunting men went straight into his saddlebags, untouched, unspent. Penance for sins that no amount of captured outlaws could ever wash clean. At 32, Jack Morrison carried the weight of too many battles, too many friends buried in unmarked graves, too many nights wondering why he'd survived when better men hadn't. The war between the states had ended a decade ago, but for some men the fighting never truly stopped. It just changed venues, from muddy fields in Virginia to the sun-baked territories where justice came at the end of a gun barrel, and mercy was a luxury few could afford. Another cry from the saloon, followed by harsh laughter. Jack's horse, a steady sorrel mare named Duchess, shifted restlessly beneath him, sensing her rider's tension. The smart thing would be to find the livery stable, tend to his horse, get a room, and ask around about Valdez in the morning. The smart thing would be to mind his own business. But Jack Morrison had learned long ago that the smart thing and the right thing rarely occupied the same territory. He dismounted slowly, his spurs chiming softly against the dusty street. The Broken Wheel Saloon squatted like a festering wound at the heart of Perdition Wells, its weathered board walls advertising everything from whiskey to companionship in faded paint. This was the kind of place where decent folks didn't venture after dark, where questions weren't asked and answers weren't volunteered. Through the swinging doors, Jack could see the interior clearly now. Oil lamps cast dancing shadows across scarred wooden tables, where hard-faced men played cards and harder-faced women served rot-gut whiskey. And there, near the bar, he saw what had drawn his attention. A girl, no, a young woman, maybe 20 years old, was on her hands and knees scrubbing the filthy floor. Her dress, once perhaps blue or gray, was now the color of dirt and despair. Her light brown hair hung in lank strands around a face that might have been pretty if it hadn't been marked by exhaustion and fear. As Jack watched, a heavy-set man with graying hair and cruel eyes grabbed her by the arm and yanked her roughly to her feet. "You missed a spot, girl," the man snarled, his voice carrying clearly through the thin walls. "And when you're done with that, the spittoons need emptying. Then you can get started on tomorrow's bread." The young woman nodded quickly, too quickly, with the practiced submission of someone who'd learned that compliance meant survival. But Jack could see the spark of something else in her eyes. Not quite rebellion, but not complete surrender either. It was the look of a caged animal who still remembered what freedom felt like. The heavy-set man, who Jack assumed was the saloon's owner, drew back his hand as if to strike her again. The woman flinched, raising her arms protectively. And in that moment, Jack Morrison saw something that made his blood run cold with recognition. He saw himself, 10 years younger and a lifetime ago, cowering before a Confederate sergeant who took pleasure in the pain of others. He saw every helpless moment from the war, every time he'd been too small, too young, too powerless to fight back against cruelty and injustice. But he wasn't that frightened boy anymore. The saloon doors swung open with a bang that silenced every conversation in the room. Jack Morrison stepped inside, his presence filling the doorway like an approaching storm. 6 feet of lean muscle and hard-earned scars, dressed in black from his flat-brimmed hat to his worn leather boots. His gray eyes swept the room once, cataloging exits and threats with the automatic efficiency of a man who'd made too many enemies to ever truly relax. When his gaze finally settled on the heavy-set man still gripping the young woman's arm, there was something in Jack's expression that made even the hardest men in the room suddenly find their drinks fascinating. "Evening," Jack said quietly, his voice carrying despite its soft tone. "Seems like there might be a problem here." The room held its breath, sensing that something momentous was about to unfold. In the amber lamplight, with shadows dancing across his weathered face, Jack Morrison looked like exactly what he was. A man who'd seen too much death to be impressed by threats, and who dealt out too much justice to be deterred by odds. The heavy-set man, Silas Kane, though Jack didn't know the name yet, slowly released the young woman's arm and turned to face this newcomer. His small, pig-like eyes glittered with a mixture of anger and calculation. "No problem here, stranger," Silas said, his voice deceptively mild. "Just disciplining my property." Property. The word hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Jack's hand didn't move toward his gun. It didn't need to. Every man in that room could feel the violence coiled inside him, like a rattlesnake ready to strike. "Property," Jack repeated, as if tasting something bitter. That's an interesting way to describe a human being. And in that moment, with the weight of his war-earned gold heavy in his saddlebags and the memory of too many injustices burning in his chest, Jack Morrison made a decision that would change two lives forever. The negotiation was about to begin. The silence that followed Jack's words stretched tight as a hangman's rope. Every eye in the Broken Wheel Saloon was fixed on the lean stranger in black, waiting to see if he was fool enough to push this confrontation further. Most men who challenged Silas Kane in his own place ended up feeding buzzards in the desert. But there was something about this newcomer that made even Kane's most loyal cronies shift uncomfortably in their chairs. Jack let his gaze sweep the room again, taking mental inventory. 8 men total, not counting Kane himself. 2 at the corner table looked like drifters, dangerous enough in a fight but unlikely to risk their necks for someone else's business. 3 card players at the center table had the soft look of merchants or clerks trying to play tough. The real threats were the 3 men standing near the bar, hard-faced gunmen with the easy confidence of killers. Long odds, but not impossible. Jack had faced worse during the war. "Property," he said again, his voice carrying that peculiar quietness that made smart men pay attention. "See, I've got a philosophical problem with that word when it's applied to people. Had my fill of it during the recent unpleasantness down south." Silas Kane's face flushed red above his graying beard. "You some kind of abolitionist? War's over, boy. Reconstruction's done. This here's just business." "Business." Jack's smile was winter cold. "What kind of business would that be exactly?" The young woman stood frozen between them, her eyes darting from Jack to Kane like a rabbit caught between 2 predators. Up close, Jack could see the full extent of her mistreatment. Her dress was patched and repatched, her hands raw from harsh soap and hard work. But it was her eyes that hit him hardest, green as spring grass but dulled by months or maybe years of systematic cruelty. She reminded him of someone, though he couldn't place who. Maybe it was just the look of beaten-down hope that he'd seen too many times in too many places. "Sarah here came to me when she had nowhere else to go," Kane said, his tone taking on the practiced smoothness of a man accustomed to justifying the unjustifiable. "Parents died of fever. No family, no prospects. I took her in out of Christian charity, gave her food and shelter when she would have starved." Jack's eyes flicked to Sarah's face and saw the flash of anger there, quickly suppressed. Whatever Kane's version of Christian charity involved, it clearly hadn't included much in the way of kindness. "Generous of you," Jack said dryly. "And in return? She works for her keep. Honest work, cleaning, cooking, serving drinks. Nothing unwholesome, if that's what you're thinking." Kane's protesting tone suggested that unwholesome thoughts were exactly what he wanted people to think, even as he denied them. "How much does she owe you?" The question seemed to catch Kane off guard. "What?" "For this Christian charity of yours. Room and board for however long she's been here. Food, shelter, protection. Must add up to a considerable sum by now." Jack's voice remained conversational, but there was steel underneath it. "I'm thinking a debt like that might be transferred to someone with better credit." Kane's small eyes glittered with sudden interest. "You looking to buy her contract?" "I'm looking to settle a debt between neighbors," Jack corrected smoothly. "What's the number?" Sarah's head snapped up, her green eyes wide with something that might have been hope. Kane studied Jack's face, clearly trying to determine how serious this offer was and how much money might be involved. "Well now," Kane said slowly, Sarah's been with me near on 2 years. Room, board, clothes, protection from the sort of men who might take advantage of a girl on her own? He paused, doing calculations in his head. Figure it comes to about $800. It was an outrageous sum, enough to buy a good horse and saddle or stake a claim in gold country. More than most working men saw in 2 years, but Jack had been hunting bounties for a decade, and his saddlebags held the accumulated rewards for some of the most wanted men in 3 territories. 800's a lot of money, Jack said mildly. Quality protection don't come cheap, Kane replied, his confidence growing. Course, if you ain't got that kind of cash. Jack reached into his coat and pulled out a leather wallet thick with bills. Kane's eyes fixed on it like a starving man eyeing a Sunday roast. Around the saloon, conversations died as men leaned forward to get a better look at more money than most of them had ever seen in one place. I'll give you 900, Jack said quietly. The offer hung in the air like gun smoke. $900. More than Kane had asked for, more than any sane man would pay for one girl's freedom. But Jack Morrison had learned that sometimes you had to pay more than something was worth to prove how much it mattered to you. Kane's face went through a series of expressions: surprise, greed, suspicion, and finally calculation. 900, he repeated slowly. Gold eagles, Jack clarified, pulling a small leather pouch from his pocket and setting it on the nearest table with a soft clink. United States currency, properly minted. No scrip, no promises. Sarah's hands were pressed to her mouth, her eyes shining with tears she was afraid to shed. Around the saloon, men were muttering among themselves, some envious, others suspicious of any stranger who carried that kind of money. Kane reached for the pouch, but Jack's hand was there first, covering it. We clear on the terms? Jack asked. $900, her debt paid in full, no further obligations on either side? Clear as glass, Kane said quickly, his fingers already twitching toward the gold. Sarah, go get your things. Looks like you're moving up in the world. But Jack didn't remove his hand from the pouch. One more thing. I want a bill of sale. Something in writing that shows the debt's been settled. Kane's face darkened. You calling my word into question? I'm calling human nature into question, Jack replied calmly. Man might develop a convenient memory problem when this much money's involved. Might decide he's owed more, or that the terms weren't quite what he remembered. For a moment, the air in the saloon crackled with tension. Then Kane forced a laugh. Smart man. I respect that in a fellow businessman. He turned to the bartender. Pete, bring me some paper and a pencil. As Pete scurried to comply, Jack found himself meeting Sarah's eyes across the smoky room. She was staring at him with a mixture of wonder and disbelief, as if he might vanish like a mirage if she looked away. He tried to give her a reassuring smile, but wasn't sure he succeeded. It had been a long time since he'd tried to comfort anyone. The bill of sale was crude but legally binding. A few lines stating that the debt between Sarah Collins and Silas Kane was paid in full for the sum of $900, dated and signed in Kane's surprisingly neat handwriting. Jack read it carefully before folding it and tucking it into his vest pocket. Pleasure doing business, Kane said, finally closing his fingers around the leather pouch. The weight of the gold made his eyes shine with avarice. Indeed, Jack replied, though something in his tone suggested the pleasure was entirely one-sided. Sarah had returned with a small bundle that apparently contained all her worldly possessions. She stood uncertainly by Jack's side, still not quite believing her situation had changed. Where? She began, then stopped, as if afraid to ask questions. First thing, we get you a proper meal, Jack said gently. Then we figure out what comes next. As they turned to leave, Kane's voice followed them. You take good care of her now, Morrison. Girl like that's got to be treated right. Jack paused at the doors, his hand resting on Sarah's elbow. How'd you know my name? Kane's smile was all teeth and no warmth. Word travels fast in a place like this. Jack Morrison, bounty hunter. They say you've brought in more wanted men than any lawman in the territory. They say a lot of things, Jack replied evenly, most of them true. They also say you're fast with that colt of yours. Real fast. Fast enough. Kane's smile widened. Good to know. Wouldn't want Sarah's new protector to be anything less than capable. There was something in Kane's tone that made Jack's instincts prickle, but he couldn't quite put his finger on what. Instead, he simply touched the brim of his hat in a mockery of politeness and guided Sarah toward the door. Outside, the cool night air felt clean after the stale atmosphere of the saloon. Sarah took a deep breath, as if she were tasting freedom for the first time in years. "Is it really true?" she asked quietly. "Am I really free?" Jack looked down at her upturned face, seeing hope and fear warring in her green eyes. "It's true," he said firmly. "You don't belong to anyone now except yourself." Sarah's legs suddenly gave out, and she would have fallen if Jack hadn't caught her arm. 2 years of hoping against hope, of enduring Kane's casual cruelty while dreaming of escape, had finally caught up with her. "Easy," Jack said gently, helping her to a wooden bench outside the general store. "You're safe now." "I don't understand," Sarah said, tears finally spilling down her cheeks. "Why would you do this? You don't even know me." Jack was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the desert stars. "Let's just say I've got some debts of my own to pay," he said finally. "Consider this an installment." It wasn't the whole truth, but it was all the truth he was ready to share. The whole truth involved memories of helplessness, of standing by while others suffered because he was too young, or too weak, or too afraid to intervene. The whole truth involved a promise he'd made to a dying friend in a field hospital outside Atlanta. A promise to use whatever strength he'd gained to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. Sarah seemed to sense that there were depths to his answer that she wasn't meant to probe, at least not yet. Instead, she wiped her eyes and asked, "What happens now?" "Now we get you fed and find you a place to stay for the night," Jack said. "Tomorrow we can talk about what you want to do next." "I want to go with you," Sarah said quickly, then blushed as if surprised by her own boldness. Jack studied her face in the starlight. "The life I lead isn't easy. Dangerous men, long days in the saddle, sleeping rough more often than not. It's no life for a lady." "I'm not a lady," Sarah said with a bitter laugh. "I'm just a girl who's been scrubbing floors and emptying spittoons for 2 years. I can handle rough." There was steel in her voice that reminded Jack why she'd survived as long as she had under Kane's roof. Maybe she was stronger than she looked. "We'll see," he said noncommittally. "One day at a time." As they sat together on the bench, watching the saloon's lamplight spill yellow squares onto the dusty street, neither of them noticed the shadow moving behind the grimy windows of the broken wheel. Silas Kane was watching them, his fingers caressing the leather pouch full of gold, his small eyes glittering with something that might have been regret, or might have been calculation. $900 was a lot of money, but Silas Kane was a man who'd built his fortune on the principle that there was always more profit to be made if you were willing to break a few rules. And sometimes the most profitable thing of all was learning to want what you'd already sold. Inside the saloon, Kane was already making plans. Dawn came to Perdition Wells like a reluctant witness, painting the desert sky in shades of amber and rose that should have been beautiful but somehow felt ominous in the morning stillness. Jack had spent the night in the town's only boarding house, a ramshackle affair run by a widow named Mrs. Garrett, who asked no questions as long as the money was good. Sarah had been given a small room at the end of the hall, the first private space she'd had in 2 years. Jack knocked softly on her door as the sun crested the eastern mountains. "Sarah? Time to go." Her response came immediately, as if she'd been awake for hours. "I'm ready." When the door opened, Jack barely recognized the young woman from the night before. Clean water and soap had revealed the true color of her hair, a rich chestnut brown that caught the morning light. Her face, washed free of grime and exhaustion, showed delicate features and skin that was pale but healthy. Most remarkably, her green eyes held something they'd lacked in the saloon: hope. She'd somehow managed to clean and mend her dress, and though it was still clearly a working woman's garment, it no longer looked like the rags of someone who'd given up on dignity. In her hands, she clutched the same small bundle of possessions she'd carried from the broken wheel. "Where are we going?" she asked as they descended the boarding house stairs. "First breakfast," Jack said. "Then we collect my gear and head out of town. I've got business in Tucson, and this place—" He glanced toward the Broken Wheel Saloon, already showing signs of life despite the early hour. This place has a bad feeling to it. Mrs. Garrett provided them with a simple breakfast of coffee, biscuits, and salt pork. Sarah ate slowly, savoring each bite as if she couldn't quite believe the food was hers, by right rather than grudging charity. Jack found himself studying her face, noting the way she held herself straighter now, the way her eyes no longer darted constantly toward the exits. "Tell me about yourself," he said as they ate. "Before Kane, I mean." Sarah's spoon paused halfway to her mouth. "Not much to tell. My parents had a small farm about 30 miles north of here. Nothing fancy, just enough to get by. Then the fever came through 3 winters ago and—" She shrugged, but Jack could see the pain she was trying to hide. "I was all alone. No relatives, no money. The bank took the farm for back taxes. How'd you end up with Kane?" "He found me trying to sleep in the barn behind the church. Said he had work for me, room and board in exchange for helping around the saloon." Sarah's laugh was bitter. "I was so grateful. I actually thanked him." Jack felt that familiar anger burning in his chest, the same righteous fury that had carried him through 3 years of war and a decade of hunting the worst men the frontier had to offer. "How long before you realized what kind of work he really had in mind?" "About a week," Sarah said quietly. "By then, I was too deep in debt to leave, or so he said. Every day I stayed, the bill got higher. Food, lodging, the cost of replacing things I supposedly broke or ruined. I tried to run once, after about 6 months. He caught me before I got 5 miles out of town." "What did he do?" Sarah rolled up her left sleeve, revealing a puckered scar on her forearm. "Said it was a lesson about what happened to ungrateful girls. Told me the next time it wouldn't be just my arm." Jack's coffee cup cracked in his grip, the sound sharp in the quiet dining room. Mrs. Garrett looked over with concern, but he waved her away with an apologetic smile. "That's over now," he said firmly. "He can't hurt you anymore." Sarah nodded, but Jack could see the doubt lingering in her eyes. 2 years of systematic intimidation and abuse weren't easily forgotten, even with a signed bill of sale in his pocket. They were finishing their meal when the boarding house door swung open and Silas Kane stepped inside, flanked by 2 of his gunmen from the previous night. In the harsh morning light, Kane looked even more brutal than he had by lamplight, a thick-set man with small, cruel eyes and hands that looked more comfortable around a weapon than a whiskey bottle. "Morrison," Kane called out cheerfully, as if they were old friends meeting for breakfast. "Mind if we join you?" Jack's hand moved instinctively toward his Colt, but Kane held up his hands in a peaceful gesture. "No need for unpleasantness. Just want to have a friendly conversation." "Conversation about what?" Jack asked, though he was already beginning to suspect where this was heading. Kane pulled out a chair and sat down uninvited, his 2 companions taking positions that blocked the room's exits. "About business. Specifically about that business we concluded last night." Sarah had gone very still beside Jack, her face pale with the kind of fear that spoke of recent and bitter experience. She knew Kane's moods better than anyone, and whatever was coming, it wasn't good. "Our business is finished," Jack said evenly. "I paid your price, you signed the paper. Sarah's debt is cleared." "Well, see, that's where things get a bit complicated," Kane said, his tone still unnaturally friendly. "Turns out I made a mistake last night. Got caught up in the moment, you might say. Didn't think things through properly." "What kind of mistake?" Kane reached into his vest and pulled out a folded document. "This here's Sarah's original indenture contract, the one her parents signed before they died, binding her to work off their medical debts. Seems I forgot all about it last night." Jack felt ice forming in his stomach, but kept his expression neutral. "Let me see that." The document was clearly a forgery, the ink too fresh, the paper too new. But it was also clearly official-looking enough to fool a territorial judge if it came to that. According to the contract, Sarah's parents had borrowed nearly $2,000 for medical care, and their daughter was bound to work off the debt at a rate of $50 per year. 40 years, Kane said with mock sadness. That's how long Sarah would need to work to pay off what her family owed. Of course, that's not counting room and board, which runs about $100 a year, or the cost of replacing things she breaks, or medical care if she gets sick. "This is garbage," Jack said flatly. "Pure fabrication." Maybe so, Kane agreed cheerfully, but it's legal garbage, properly notarized and filed with the territorial authority in Phoenix. Even if you could prove it was fake, that would take months in court, and Sarah would have to stay here while the matter was settled. Sarah was trembling now, her hands clenched so tight her knuckles were white. You said I was free, she whispered. You promised. Kane's false friendliness finally slipped, revealing the predator underneath. Girl, you ain't never going to be free. You belong to me, and that's how it's going to stay. Jack's hand was a blur as he drew his Colt, the barrel centering on Kane's forehead before the man could blink. Around the room, chairs scraped as Kane's men went for their guns, but Jack's voice stopped them cold. Easy, boys. First one to clear leather gets to watch his boss's brains paint the wall. For a moment, the dining room was frozen in a tableau of violence barely held in check. Kane's face had gone pale, but his eyes still held their calculating gleam. You won't shoot me, Morrison, he said with forced confidence. Not in cold blood, not with witnesses. You're supposed to be one of the good ones. Jack smiled, and it was a terrible expression on his weathered face. You're right about one thing, Kane. I won't shoot you in cold blood. The Colt disappeared back into its holster with the same fluid motion that had drawn it. But you made a mistake last night, and it's going to cost you. What mistake was that? You took my money under false pretenses. That makes you a thief. Jack stood slowly, his hand resting casually near his gun. And I've built my reputation hunting thieves. Kane's confident facade finally cracked. You can't prove I knew about this contract last night. Don't need to prove it, Jack replied. Just need to decide how much your life is worth to you. The silence stretched taut as a bowstring. Finally, Kane pushed back from the table, his chair scraping loudly against the wooden floor. You think about this, Morrison, he said, his voice shaking with barely controlled rage. Think real hard. You're one man against my whole organization. You can't watch her every minute of every day, and when you slip up, he smiled, showing teeth stained yellow by tobacco and neglect. Well, let's just say accidents happen to pretty girls who don't know their place. With that, Kane and his men filed out of the boarding house, leaving Jack and Sarah alone with Mrs. Garrett, who was trying very hard to pretend she hadn't witnessed the entire confrontation. Sarah buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with suppressed sobs. I'm so sorry, she whispered. You paid all that money, and it was for nothing. I should have known he wouldn't let me go. I should have warned you. Jack reached over and gently pulled her hands away from her face. Look at me, Sarah. When she finally met his eyes, he spoke with quiet conviction. You are not going back to him. Not today, not ever. That's a promise. But the contract is a fake, and we both know it. But even if it were real, there are ways to break contracts, legal ways, and Jack's smile was winter cold. Other ways? Sarah stared at him, seeing something in his expression that made her feel safer and more frightened all at the same time. What are you going to do? What I do best, Jack said simply, but first we need to get you somewhere safe. Kane's not going to let this go, and as long as we're in his town, you're in danger. They gathered their few possessions quickly, Jack's movements economical and purposeful. He'd been in similar situations before, outnumbered in hostile territory, protecting someone who couldn't protect themselves. It was a familiar dance, even if the stakes felt more personal this time. As they prepared to leave the boarding house, Mrs. Garrett approached with a small bundle wrapped in cloth. Food for the road, she said quietly, and a word of advice. Don't take the main trail out of town. Kane's got men watching it. There's an old mining road that heads north toward the hills. Harder going, but safer. Jack nodded his thanks, dropping a silver dollar on the counter. You didn't see which way we went. See who? Mrs. Garrett replied with a slight smile. I don't recall anyone staying here last night. Outside, Jack loaded their supplies onto Duchess while Sarah stood nervously by, scanning the street for any sign of Kane's men. The town was fully awake now, but there was a tension in the air that hadn't been there the day before. Word of the confrontation had clearly spread, and people were staying indoors or hurrying about their business with downcast eyes. Ready? Jack asked, offering Sarah his hand to help her mount behind him. She hesitated for just a moment, looking back at the Broken Wheel saloon where she'd spent 2 years of her life. Then she firmly grasped Jack's hand and swung up onto Duchess's back. "Ready," she said, and there was steel in her voice that hadn't been there before. As they rode out of Perdition Wells on the old mining road, neither of them looked back. But if they had, they would have seen Silas Kane standing in the doorway of his saloon, watching them go with the patient intensity of a predator who knew that some hunts were worth waiting for. In his hand, Kane clutched the leather pouch full of Jack's gold, and his mind was already working on the problem of how to keep both the money and the girl. He'd built his empire by taking what he wanted and keeping what he took, and Jack Morrison's moral grandstanding wasn't going to change that now. Kane smiled and turned back into the saloon, where his men were waiting for orders. The hunt was about to begin. The old mining road wound through a landscape of red stone and sparse vegetation, climbing steadily into the foothills where forgotten claims had once yielded silver and hope in equal measure. Jack pushed Duchess hard for the first few hours, putting distance between them and Perdition Wells while the morning was still cool. Sarah rode behind him in silence, her arms wrapped around his waist, her body tense with the constant expectation of pursuit. It wasn't until they crested a ridge that offered a commanding view of the valley below that Jack finally allowed himself to relax slightly. From this height, any riders following them would be visible for miles, and the narrow trail would force attackers to come at them one at a time rather than as a group. "We'll rest here," Jack said, swinging down from the saddle. "Let Duchess catch her breath and figure out our next move." Sarah dismounted carefully, her legs stiff from the unfamiliar ride. She was trying hard not to show how much the morning's events had shaken her, but Jack could see the fear she was working to control. "They're going to come after us, aren't they?" she said, stating it as fact rather than asking a question. "Probably," Jack admitted. Kane's not the type to let go of something he considers his property, and $900 is a lot of money to write off as a loss. Sarah sank down on a flat rock, her shoulders sagging with exhaustion. "Maybe I should go back. Maybe if I worked really hard, I could pay off the debt in a few years instead of 40. "Stop!" Jack's voice was sharp enough to cut her off mid-sentence. "Don't you ever say that again. What Kane's doing isn't about debt or work or any kind of legitimate business. It's about power and control and the pleasure he takes in making other people suffer. But if I go back, maybe he'll leave you alone." "Sarah!" Jack knelt in front of her, his gray eyes intense. "I've seen enough evil in this world to recognize it when it's standing right in front of me. Kane is evil, pure and simple. And evil doesn't get better when you feed it. It just gets stronger." Sarah met his gaze, seeing something there that made her believe him despite her fear. "So what do we do?" Jack stood and walked to the edge of the ridge, studying the terrain below with the practiced eye of a man who'd learned to read landscape like a book. "We wait," he said finally. "Let Kane make his move, then we respond accordingly." "You think he'll follow us himself?" "No," Jack said slowly. "Kane's not the type to do his own dirty work when he can send someone else to do it for him, but he'll send his best men, and they'll be motivated by more than just money." As if summoned by his words, a distant dust cloud appeared on the main road leading out of Perdition Wells. Even at this distance, Jack could count 4 or 5 riders moving fast and with purpose. "There they are," he said grimly. Sarah squinted into the distance, her hand shading her eyes. "How long before they reach us?" "Couple hours, maybe less if they push their horses hard." Jack was already moving, checking his weapons and gear with the methodical precision of a man preparing for war. "They'll follow our trail easy enough. Duchess leaves distinctive tracks, and we weren't trying to hide our passage." "Are you going to fight them?" Jack paused in his preparations, considering the question. 5 against 1 aren't good odds, even for someone with my experience. Better to avoid the confrontation if possible. But even as he said it, Jack knew that avoiding this fight would only postpone the inevitable. Kane wouldn't give up after one failed attempt, and sooner or later they'd have to make a stand. Better to choose the time and place himself than wait for Kane to force the issue. "What if we doubled back?" Sarah suggested. "Went around them somehow." "Then we'd just be running for the rest of our lives," Jack replied, "and Kane would just keep sending men after us until one of them got lucky. No, this ends tonight, one way or another." The sun was setting by the time they made camp in a small canyon about 2 miles from the main trail. Jack had chosen the spot carefully. Good cover, multiple escape routes, and a clear field of fire for anyone foolish enough to approach openly. He built a small fire, just enough to heat coffee and warm some of Mrs. Garrett's provisions, then carefully extinguished it before full darkness fell. "Try to get some sleep," he told Sarah as he checked his weapons one final time. "I'll take first watch." "I won't be able to sleep," Sarah said, but she dutifully wrapped herself in the spare blanket Jack had provided. "What happens if they find us?" "They won't," Jack said with quiet confidence. "But if they do, you follow that trail there up the canyon wall. Don't stop. Don't look back. Don't wait for me. Just run until you reach the old mining camp at the top of the ridge." Sarah started to protest, but something in Jack's expression stopped her. This wasn't a discussion or a suggestion. It was an order given by a man who'd learned to make life and death decisions in the space between heartbeats. "Promise me," he said. "I promise," Sarah whispered. Jack nodded once, then settled into the shadows where he could watch the approaches to their camp. The desert night was alive with sounds: the distant yip of coyotes, the whisper of wind through stone, the soft rustle of small creatures going about their nocturnal business. To most people, it would have been an alien, frightening soundscape. To Jack, it was as familiar as his own heartbeat. He'd learned to read the desert during his bounty hunting years, learned to distinguish between the natural sounds of night and the subtle disturbances that marked human passage. So when the normal chorus of insects suddenly went quiet in a specific direction, he knew they were no longer alone. Jack eased his Colt from its holster, the well-oiled metal sliding silently against leather. Somewhere out in the darkness, Kane's men were moving into position, probably planning to attack at dawn when their targets would be sleepy and unprepared. They were in for a surprise. Jack waited another hour, letting Kane's men settle into whatever positions they'd chosen, letting them grow confident in their superior numbers and tactical advantage. Then, moving with the fluid silence of a man who'd learned stealth in the killing fields of Virginia, he began his own hunt. The first sentry was positioned on a low ridge overlooking their camp, armed with a rifle and probably congratulating himself on having the high ground. He never heard Jack coming. One moment he was scanning the canyon floor through his rifle scope. The next he was unconscious on the ground with a rapidly swelling lump behind his left ear. Jack took the man's rifle and ammunition, then moved on to the next position. The second guard was more alert, but also more predictable, stationed exactly where Jack would have put him if he'd been planning this ambush. This one got a glimpse of movement in his peripheral vision before Jack's gun butt connected with his skull. The third man was the most dangerous, a lean gunfighter with quick reflexes and the kind of paranoia that kept men alive in this business. Jack almost admired his professionalism right up until the moment he put him to sleep with a perfectly applied sleeper Hole learned from a Cherokee tracker during the war. That left two men in the camp itself, probably wondering why their sentries weren't checking in as scheduled. Jack could hear them whispering to each other, their voices carrying clearly in the thin desert air. "Something's wrong," one of them was saying. "Billy should have signaled by now." "Maybe he fell asleep," the other replied, but his tone suggested he didn't believe it himself. "Billy don't fall asleep on watch, never has." Jack smiled grimly. Smart men, but not smart enough. He'd left their unconscious companions alive partly out of professional courtesy, and partly because he wanted Kane's remaining forces to be looking over their shoulders, wondering when the ghost in the night would come for them too. Moving like a shadow, Jack circled around to approach the enemy camp from the least expected direction. The two remaining men had taken cover behind some rocks, about 50 yards from where they thought Jack and Sarah were sleeping. They were focused on their target so intently that they never noticed the figure materializing out of the darkness behind them. "Evening, boys," Jack said conversationally. Both men spun around, hands reaching for weapons, but froze when they found themselves staring down the barrel of Jack's Colt. In the starlight, his gray eyes were cold as winter ice. "Names," Jack said quietly. "What?" one of them stammered. "Your names. I like to know who I'm dealing with." Tom Bradley," the first man said. "Pete Hansen," added the second, his voice slightly steadier. "Well, Tom and Pete, you boys have a choice to make," Jack continued in that same conversational tone. "You can ride back to Kane and tell him that his little game is over, or you can join your friends in taking a nice long nap. Either way, this harassment ends tonight. We ain't done nothing wrong, Tom protested. Just following orders. Following orders to kidnap a woman and kill a man, Jack pointed out. That's generally considered something wrong in most jurisdictions. Pete, who seemed to be the smarter of the two, was studying Jack's face with growing recognition. You're Morrison, he said suddenly. Jack Morrison, the bounty hunter. Guilty as charged. They say you killed 15 men in a single gunfight down in Yuma. Only 12, Jack corrected mildly. Newspapers always exaggerate. The correction seemed to terrify Pete more than the original claim would have. Tom was looking back and forth between them, slowly realizing he was caught between his employer's anger and a man who'd built his reputation on being faster and more deadly than anyone else in the territory. What do you want us to tell Kane? Tom asked finally. Jack's smile was all teeth and no warmth. Tell him his business arrangement with Sarah Collins is terminated permanently. Tell him that if he sends anyone else after her, I'll start collecting bounties on his men, whether there's paper out on them or not. And tell him, Jack paused, his expression growing even colder. Tell him that if he wants to settle this personal I'll be in Perdition Wells tomorrow night. Pete swallowed hard. You're going back. I'm going back, Jack confirmed. See, your boss made a mistake. He took my money and then tried to steal it back. That makes him a thief. And I've got a professional obligation to settle accounts with thieves. The two men exchanged glances, clearly weighing their options. Finally, Pete nodded slowly. We'll deliver your message. I thought you might. Jack gestured toward the unconscious forms of their companions. Collect your friends and head home. And boys, if I see any of you on my trail again, I won't be nearly so accommodating. Tom and Pete didn't need to be told twice. They gathered up their semi-conscious companions and helped them onto their horses, the whole operation conducted in nervous silence under Jack's watchful eye. Within 10 minutes, the sound of hoofbeats was fading into the distance, leaving Jack alone in the desert night. He waited another hour before returning to their camp, where he found Sarah sitting up and staring into the darkness with wide, frightened eyes. Jack, she called softly. Is that you? It's me, he confirmed, settling down beside the cold ashes of their fire. Everything's all right. I heard voices and horses. Kane's men. They won't be bothering us again tonight. Sarah studied his face in the starlight, noting the calm satisfaction in his expression. What did you do? Had a conversation with them. Explained the situation. They decided they had better things to do than harass innocent travelers. You're going back to Perdition Wells, aren't you? Sarah said suddenly. I heard you tell them you'd be there tomorrow night. Jack was quiet for a moment, surprised by her perceptiveness. This has to end, Sarah. Kane won't stop sending men after us unless I give him a reason to stop. He'll try to kill you. He'll try, Jack agreed. But I've been in worse situations than one crooked saloon owner and whatever hired guns he can scrape together. Sarah was quiet for a long time, staring up at the desert stars. Finally, she said, I'm going with you. No, you're not. Yes, I am. Her voice was firm, carrying a strength that surprised them both. For 2 years, I let that man control my life, make my decisions, tell me what I was worth. I'm not going to hide in the desert while someone else fights my battles. Jack turned to look at her, seeing something new in her green eyes. Not just determination, but a kind of fierce resolve that reminded him of the best soldiers he'd known during the war. It's going to be dangerous, he warned. I know. Kane plays by his own rules. There's no guarantee he'll fight fair. I know that too. Jack studied her face for a long moment, then slowly nodded. All right, but we do this my way, and when I tell you to do something, you do it without question or argument. Understood? Understood. As they settled in to wait for dawn, Jack found himself thinking about the strange turns his life had taken in the past 2 days. He'd come to Perdition Wells chasing a bounty on Joaquin Valdez, and instead found himself protecting a young woman who was rapidly proving to be stronger and more resilient than her circumstances suggested. Maybe that was how redemption worked, not through grand gestures or dramatic moments of revelation, but through small choices made in desert darkness, through promises kept to people who had no reason to expect kindness from a hard world. Tomorrow night, he would face Silas Kane in the man's own territory, surrounded by his allies and advantages. The smart money would be on Kane, but Jack Morrison had never been one to bet on the smart money. He had promises to keep and debts to settle, and sometimes that was enough to tip the scales in favor of justice, even in a place as godforsaken as Perdition Wells. The desert wind whispered through the canyon, carrying the scent of sage and the promise of dawn. In a few hours, they would begin the ride back toward whatever waited for them in that dusty town. But for now, they were safe, they were together, and they were free. It was more than either of them had dared hope for just 24 hours ago. Dawn broke clear and cold over the desert canyon, painting the red stone walls in shades of gold and amber that spoke of ancient patience and enduring strength. Jack had been awake for an hour before sunrise, checking their gear and studying the trail that would take them back toward Perdition Wells. Sarah woke to find him sitting cross-legged on a flat rock, field stripping his Colt with the methodical precision of a man preparing for war. "Sleep well?" he asked without looking up from his weapon. "Better than I have in months," Sarah admitted, which was true despite the circumstances. For the first time in 2 years, she'd fallen asleep without wondering what fresh humiliation or cruelty the next day would bring. Jack nodded, reassembling his pistol with fluid movements that spoke of long practice. "We'll head out in a few minutes. Want to reach the old trading post at Copper Creek before noon. Is that where we're meeting Kane?" "No," Jack said, finally looking at her with those steady gray eyes. "Copper Creek's where we're going to make sure you're safe before I go back to Perdition Wells." Sarah felt her jaw tighten. "We discussed this last night. I'm going with you." "I said we'd discuss it. I didn't say I'd agree to it." Jack stood, holstering his weapon with a movement so smooth it seemed like sleight of hand. "Kane's not going to fight fair, Sarah. Men like him never do. He'll have backup, probably hostages, maybe even law on his payroll. It's going to be ugly, and I won't have you caught in the middle of it." "And what if you don't come back?" Sarah shot back, surprising herself with her vehemence. "What if Kane kills you? What happens to me then?" The question hung in the morning air between them, stark and practical and impossible to ignore. Jack had been so focused on the tactical aspects of confronting Kane that he hadn't really considered what would happen to Sarah if things went wrong. "There's a mission at Copper Creek," he said finally, "run by a priest named Father Miguel. Good man, one of the few I trust completely. He'll make sure you're safe, help you get to California or Denver or wherever you want to start over." "I don't want to start over somewhere else," Sarah said, her voice gaining strength. "I want to finish what we started. I want to see Kane get what he deserves." Jack studied her face, noting the set of her jaw and the fire in her green eyes. This wasn't the broken, frightened girl he'd rescued from the Broken Wheel Saloon. Something had changed during their night in the desert. Some inner strength had awakened that wouldn't be easily denied. "You ever kill a man, Sarah?" he asked quietly. The question seemed to catch her off guard. "What?" "No, of course not." "Ever even point a gun at someone?" "No." "Then you don't understand what you're asking for." Jack's voice was gentle but implacable. "Killing changes you. Even when it's justified, even when it's necessary, it leaves marks on your soul that never fully heal. I won't be responsible for putting those marks on you." Sarah was quiet for a moment, considering his words. Then she said, "What about the marks Kane's already put on me? What about the scars I'll carry for the rest of my life from what he did? Don't I get to say how I want to face them?" The argument was more sophisticated than Jack had expected, and it struck closer to home than he cared to admit. He'd spent 10 years trying to atone for the things he'd done during the war. But Sarah was right. Victims deserved some say in how justice was served. "It's not about revenge," he said carefully. "It's about doing what's right. Maybe for me, those are the same thing." They stared at each other across the small canyon, two people trying to bridge the gap between their different understandings of justice and healing. Finally, Jack sighed and ran a hand through his dark hair. "If you come with me," he said slowly, "you follow my orders without question. You stay where I put you, you don't take unnecessary risks, and if I tell you to run, you run. Agreed?" Sarah's face lit up with something that might have been triumph. "Agreed. And you don't watch when it happens. When Kane and I settle our accounts. That part's not for you to see." "All right," Jack nodded curtly, still not entirely comfortable with the arrangement, but recognizing that Sarah Collins was a stronger woman than her circumstances had allowed her to show. "Then we better get moving. Long ride ahead of us." They broke camp quickly, packing their few possessions and preparing Duchess for another day of hard travel. As they mounted up, Jack found himself studying the horizon with the practiced eye of a man who'd learned to read trouble in the set of distant mountains and the color of morning clouds. "Tell me about Kane," he said as they began picking their way down the canyon trail. "How he runs his operation, who his allies are, what kind of men he employs." Sarah settled herself behind him on Duchess's back, her arms wrapping around his waist with increasing familiarity. "He owns most of the businesses in Perdition Wells, either directly or through intimidation. The sheriff's on his payroll, and so are half the town council. The men who work for him are—" She paused, searching for the right words. "They're not gunfighters exactly. More like bullies who got lucky with their first few fights and started thinking they were tougher than they really are. What about the ones who came after us last night? Tom Bradley's been with Kane for about a year. He's mean but not particularly smart. Pete Hansen's newer, maybe 6 months. Both of them are dangerous because they'll do anything Kane tells them to, but they're not professional killers." Jack nodded, filing the information away. "Kane himself. He carries a gun, but I've never seen him use it. Prefers to let other people do his fighting for him." Sarah's voice grew harder. "He's a coward, basically. Likes to hurt people who can't fight back. But I don't think he'd stand up to anyone who could actually threaten him." "Don't underestimate him," Jack warned. "Cowards can be the most dangerous enemies because they'll use tactics that honorable men wouldn't consider." They rode in comfortable silence for a while, the rhythm of Duchess's gait and the growing warmth of the sun creating a sense of peace that seemed at odds with their violent destination. Jack found himself paying attention to small details, the way Sarah's breathing synchronized with the horse's movement, the warmth of her hands on his waist, the subtle shift in her posture as she grew more confident in the saddle. "Can I ask you something?" Sarah said eventually. "Shoot. Why do you do this? Hunt bounties, I mean. You're obviously educated, skilled with weapons, good with people when you want to be. You could do anything." It was a fair question, and one that Jack had been asking himself for the better part of a decade. "Started during the war," he said finally. "Lost some friends to deserters and bushwhackers, men who'd abandoned their units to prey on civilians. When the fighting ended, those same men just kept doing what they'd been doing. Only now they called themselves outlaws instead of soldiers." "So it's about justice?" "Partly." Jack was quiet for a moment, watching a red-tailed hawk circle overhead. "But partly it's about penance." "For what?" The question hit deeper than Jack had expected, forcing him to confront memories he usually kept locked away in the darkest corners of his mind. "Things I did during the war. Orders I followed that I shouldn't have. Men I killed who probably didn't deserve it." Sarah's arms tightened slightly around his waist, offering wordless comfort. "How old were you when you enlisted?" 17. "You were just a boy." "Old enough to know right from wrong," Jack said firmly. "Old enough to be held accountable for my choices." "And young enough to be forgiven for making them," Sarah countered. "How long are you going to punish yourself for things you did when you were barely grown?" It was a question Jack had never allowed himself to seriously consider. Guilt had been his companion for so long that he'd almost forgotten what it felt like to imagine a life without it. "I don't know," he admitted. "Maybe until I've balanced the scales somehow." "And maybe that's what you're doing now," Sarah said softly. "Helping someone who needs help, protecting someone who can't protect herself. Maybe that's how scales get balanced, not by punishing yourself forever, but by doing better when you get the chance." Jack found himself thinking about her words as they continued their journey toward Copper Creek. Could redemption really be that simple? Could years of guilt and self-recrimination be answered by a few acts of kindness, a few moments of choosing to protect rather than destroy? The trading post at Copper Creek turned out to be a collection of adobe buildings clustered around a natural spring, the kind of oasis that had sustained travelers for generations before the white man ever set foot in the territory. Father Miguel proved to be a small, weathered man with kind eyes and gentle hands that spoke of a lifetime spent tending to both souls and bodies. "Jack Morrison," the priest said with genuine pleasure as they dismounted in the mission's courtyard. "It's been too long, my friend." "Father," Jack replied, clasping the older man's hand, "I need to ask a favor." "Of course, anything I can do." Father Miguel's eyes shifted to Sarah, taking in her worn clothes and the subtle signs of recent hardship with the practiced eye of someone who'd spent decades ministering to the wounded and dispossessed. "And who is this lovely young lady?" "Sarah Collins," Jack said simply. "She needs sanctuary for a few days while I settle some business in Perdition Wells." Father Miguel's expression grew grave. "Silas Kane? You know about him. Stories reach us here, even in the desert. Missing women, debts that can never be paid, men who ask too many questions and are never seen again." The priest looked directly at Sarah. "You were fortunate to escape that place, my child." "I didn't escape," Sarah said quietly. "I was rescued." Father Miguel nodded slowly, understanding passing between him and Jack without words. "Then you are doubly fortunate. Men like Jack Morrison are rare in this world." "Which is why I need to make sure he comes back safely," Sarah said, her voice carrying a determination that made both men look at her with new respect. "I'm going with her," Jack said before Father Miguel could voice the objection clearly forming on his lips. "She's earned the right to see this through." The priest studied them both for a long moment, then smiled slightly. "I see. And when do you leave for this confrontation?" "Tonight," Jack said. "We'll ride out after sunset, approach the town under cover of darkness. Then you have time for a proper meal and rest before you go." Father Miguel gestured toward the mission buildings. "Come, we'll feed your bodies and pray for your souls and send you on your way with God's blessing." As they followed the priest toward the mission dining hall, Jack found himself thinking about blessings and the strange ways they sometimes came disguised as curses. 2 days ago, he'd been a man alone, carrying his guilt like a stone in his chest and seeing no future beyond the next bounty and the one after that. Now he had someone to protect, someone who looked at him as if he might actually be worth saving. It was a responsibility he'd never asked for and wasn't sure he deserved, but it was also the first thing in years that had made him feel truly alive. Tonight he would face Silas Kane in the man's own territory, surrounded by hostile guns and corrupt law. The odds were poor and the outcome uncertain, but for the first time since the war ended, Jack Morrison had something more valuable than guilt to carry into battle. He had hope. The sun died in a blaze of crimson and gold over the Arizona desert, painting Perdition Wells in shades of blood and shadow as Jack and Sarah approached the town under cover of gathering darkness. They'd left their horses at an abandoned mining claim half a mile out, choosing to cover the final distance on foot to avoid the telltale sound of hoofbeats on the hard-packed street. Jack moved like a ghost through the scrub brush and scattered boulders that surrounded the settlement, his years of hunting dangerous men having taught him to become one with whatever terrain he found himself in. Sarah followed close behind, her natural grace and desperation born caution, making her a surprisingly good student in the art of stealth. From their position on a low ridge overlooking the town, they could see the Broken Wheel Saloon blazing with light and activity. Kane had clearly spread word that something big was happening tonight. The hitching posts were crowded with horses, and men moved back and forth across the saloon's front porch with the restless energy of predators anticipating violence. "He knows we're coming," Jack observed, studying the scene through his spyglass. "How?" "Too much activity for a normal evening. Kane's called in reinforcements, probably promised them a share of whatever he thinks he's going to get out of this." Jack collapsed the spyglass and tucked it away. "Question is, how many men are we looking at?" They spent another 20 minutes observing the saloon, counting figures and trying to identify potential threats. Jack's final tally was grim. At least a dozen men, all armed, all positioned to turn the Broken Wheel into a fortress if necessary. 12-1, Sarah whispered. "Those aren't very good odds." "No, they're not," Jack agreed, "which is why we're not going to fight them on their terms." "What do you mean?" Jack's smile was winter cold in the starlight. "Kane thinks he's the hunter tonight. Time to show him what it feels like to be the prey." They circled around to approach the town from the north, using an arroyo to stay hidden until they reached the outskirts of Perdition Wells. The back streets were mostly deserted, with only a few dim lights showing in windows where honest folks had barricaded themselves inside to wait out whatever storm was coming. Jack led Sarah to a position behind the livery stable, where they had a clear view of the Broken Wheel's rear entrance and the small alley that connected it to Kane's private office above the general store. "This is where you stay," Jack said firmly. "No matter what happens, no matter what you hear or see, you don't move from this spot until I come back for you." Sarah nodded, though he could see the tension in her posture. "What if you don't come back?" "Then you follow that alley to the church. Tell Father Rodriguez what happened, and let him help you get to Copper Creek." Jack checked his weapons one final time. Colt 45 on his right hip, backup Derringer in his boot, knife in his belt. "But I'll be back." "How can you be so sure?" Jack looked at her for a long moment, memorizing her face in the moonlight. "Because I've got something to come back for now." Before Sarah could respond to that, Jack was moving, disappearing into the shadows with the fluid silence of a hunting cat. She watched him go with a mixture of fear and admiration, wondering how she'd gotten lucky enough to be rescued by a man who seemed capable of working miracles through sheer force of will. Jack's plan was elegantly simple. Instead of walking into Kane's trap at the Broken Wheel, he was going to force Kane to come to him. And the best way to do that was to threaten the one thing Kane valued more than Sarah's captivity or Jack's death: his money. The general store's back door was locked, but Jack had learned a few things about locks during his bounty hunting career. Within 30 seconds, he was inside the building, moving through the darkened merchandise with the practiced ease of someone who'd conducted more than his share of nighttime raids. Kane's office was on the second floor, accessed by a narrow staircase that creaked ominously under Jack's weight, despite his efforts to move silently. The office door was locked as well, but this time Jack simply kicked it in, the sound of splintering wood echoing through the building like a gunshot. The office was exactly what Jack had expected: a monument to greed and corruption, with ledgers full of crooked deals and a safe that probably contained enough stolen money to buy half the territory. Jack didn't bother with subtlety. He simply placed a stick of dynamite he'd liberated from an abandoned mining claim against the safe's door and lit the fuse. The explosion that followed lit up the night sky and sent windows shattering throughout Perdition Wells. By the time the smoke cleared, Kane's safe was a twisted ruin, and Jack was already gone, melting back into the shadows with Kane's life savings stuffed into a saddlebag. The reaction from the Broken Wheel was immediate and predictable. Men poured out of the saloon like angry hornets, shouting questions and threats into the night air. Kane himself appeared on the saloon's front porch, his face purple with rage as he surveyed the smoking ruins of his office. "Morrison!" Kane bellowed, his voice carrying clearly across the town. "You coward! Come out and face me!" Jack's reply came from the darkness at the edge of town, his voice calm and conversational despite the chaos he'd just unleashed. "Right here, Kane. Just you and me. Like it should be." Kane's head snapped toward the sound, but Jack was already moving again, using the confusion and poor light to stay ahead of the men trying to surround him. He'd fought this kind of running battle before, during the war, and he knew that patience and mobility were his greatest advantages against superior numbers. "You destroyed everything," Kane screamed. 20 years of work, gone." "Should have thought of that before you decided to steal from me," Jack called back from a new position. "Should have honored our deal and let the girl go free." "She belongs to me. She's my property." "Nobody belongs to you anymore, Kane. Your reign of terror in this town is over." What followed was a deadly game of cat and mouse through the streets of Perdition Wells, with Jack using his superior skill and knowledge of tactics to stay one step ahead of Kane's increasingly frantic men. He picked them off one by one, not killing, but disabling, sending each attacker back to Kane with a message that resistance was futile. By midnight, Kane was down to 3 men and his own paranoid desperation. Jack had systematically eliminated every advantage the saloon owner had enjoyed, reducing their confrontation to its most basic elements: one man's greed and cruelty against another man's determination to see justice done. "Last chance, Kane," Jack called from his position near the town's water tower. Send your men away and face me alone. End this with whatever dignity you have left." Kane's response was a wordless snarl of rage and frustration, but after a whispered consultation with his remaining gunmen, he stepped into the street alone, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. "All right, Morrison," Kane said, his voice carrying clearly in the still night air. "Just you and me. But when I kill you, the girl comes back to me. That's the deal. The only deal you're getting is a choice between dying quick or dying slow," Jack replied, emerging from the shadows to stand in the middle of the dusty street. "Which way you want it is up to you." Kane drew first, his hand moving with the desperate speed of a man who knew his life depended on being faster than his opponent. He was quick, quicker than Jack had expected, and his bullet actually grazed Jack's left arm before Jack's own Colt cleared leather. But Jack Morrison had been practicing the art of the fast draw since he was old enough to hold a gun, and he'd been perfecting it in life or death situations for more than a decade. His shot took Kane's center mass, spinning the bigger man around and dropping him to his knees in the dust. Kane looked down at the spreading stain on his shirt, then up at Jack with an expression of profound surprise. "You actually did it," he wheezed. "You actually beat me." "Justice beat you," Jack corrected, holstering his weapon. "I was just the instrument." Kane coughed, and blood flecked his lips. "The girl, she'll never be free of me. There's others who know about her, who'll come for her." "Then I'll deal with them too," Jack said simply. "One at a time for as long as it takes." Kane tried to say something else, but the words dissolved into a final, shuddering breath. Silas Kane, who had built his empire on the suffering of others, died alone in the dust of a street he'd once ruled through fear and intimidation. Jack stood over the body for a moment, feeling not triumph but a weary satisfaction. Justice had been served, but at a cost that would stay with him for the rest of his life. Taking a man's life, even a man like Kane, was never something to celebrate. From the shadows around the saloon, Kane's remaining men were already fading away, unwilling to continue a fight that no longer offered any profit or protection. By dawn, Jack knew, most of them would be miles away, looking for easier prey and more profitable employment. "Jack," Sarah's voice came from behind him, soft and uncertain. He turned to find her standing at the mouth of the alley, her face pale in the moonlight. "I thought I told you to stay hidden." "It's over, isn't it?" she said, ignoring his gentle reproach. "Really over." Jack looked around at the scattered evidence of the night's violence. Broken windows, abandoned weapons, the still form of Silas Kane lying in the street. "It's over," he confirmed. "You're free, Sarah. Really free this time." Sarah walked slowly toward him, her eyes never leaving his face. When she reached him, she stood on her tiptoes and kissed him gently on the cheek. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything." Jack felt something inside his chest, some knot of guilt and self-recrimination that had been there so long he'd forgotten what it felt like to be without it, finally beginning to loosen. Maybe Sarah was right. Maybe redemption wasn't about endless self-punishment, but about choosing to do better when the opportunity arose. "Come on," he said, offering her his arm. "Let's get out of this place. We've got a whole new life to figure out." As they walked away from Perdition Wells toward the horizon, where dawn was beginning to paint the sky in shades of hope and possibility, neither of them looked back. The past was behind them now, buried in the dust with Silas Kane and his reign of cruelty. Ahead lay the future, uncertain, challenging, but theirs to shape as they chose, together. 3 months later, Jack Morrison stood on the front porch of a small ranch house nestled in a valley 20 miles north of Tucson, watching Sarah hang laundry on the line they'd strung between 2 cottonwood trees. The sight filled him with a contentment he'd never expected to feel again. The simple pleasure of watching someone he cared about go about the ordinary business of building a life. The ranch had belonged to an old prospector named Henrik, who died the previous winter, leaving behind 40 acres of good grazing land, a solid house, and debts that Jack had been able to settle with a portion of Kane's recovered money. The territorial government had been surprisingly understanding about the circumstances surrounding Kane's death and the redistribution of his ill-gotten wealth, especially after Father Miguel had vouched for Jack's character and the righteousness of his cause. It wasn't much. A modest spread with enough water for a small herd of cattle and a garden that Sarah had coaxed into producing vegetables, despite the challenging desert climate. But it was theirs, free and clear, with no debts and no obligations to anyone except each other. Jack had officially retired from bounty hunting the day they'd signed the deed, hanging up his guns in favor of the honest work of ranching. The transition hadn't been easy. 32 years of violence and constant motion didn't surrender easily to the rhythms of peaceful domesticity, but Sarah had been patient with his restlessness and understanding of the nightmares that sometimes still woke him in the small hours of the morning. "You're brooding again," Sarah said, approaching the porch with the empty laundry basket balanced on her hip. In the 3 months since Perdition Wells, she'd filled out from their improved circumstances, the hollow cheeks and fearful eyes replaced by the healthy glow of a woman who no longer had to wonder where her next meal was coming from or whether she'd survive another day. "Just thinking," Jack replied, making room for her on the porch swing they'd built together from lumber salvaged from an old mine. "About what?" "About how different everything is. How different I am." Jack gestured toward the peaceful valley spread out before them. 6 months ago, if someone had told me I'd be sitting on my own front porch watching my wife hang laundry, I'd have thought they were crazy." Sarah settled beside him on the swing, her shoulder warm against his. They'd been married 2 months now, in a simple ceremony at Father Miguel's mission, with only the priest and a few local ranchers as witnesses. It hadn't been a marriage born of grand passion or romantic declarations, but rather something deeper and more durable, a partnership between two people who'd found in each other exactly what they'd been missing. "Do you miss it?" Sarah asked. "The hunting, the excitement, the danger?" Jack considered the question seriously. There were times when he felt the old restlessness stirring, when the quiet routine of ranch life felt almost suffocating after years of living on the edge. But those moments were becoming rarer as he discovered the different kind of satisfaction that came from building something instead of hunting it down. "Sometimes," he admitted, "but not the way I thought I would. It's more like missing a fever after it breaks. You remember the intensity, but you don't actually want to be sick again." Sarah laughed, a sound that never failed to lift Jack's spirits. Her laughter had been one of the casualties of her time with Cain, and hearing it return had been like watching spring arrive after an especially harsh winter. "Besides," Jack continued, "I've got other things to occupy my attention now. Such as? Such as figuring out how to be a husband, learning to farm in desert country, dealing with the fact that my wife is turning out to be a much better shot than I am." This last comment was only half joking. Sarah had taken to firearms with a natural aptitude that surprised them both, and her accuracy with the Winchester they'd bought for hunting and protection had quickly surpassed Jack's own considerable skill. It was, he'd discovered, deeply satisfying to teach someone you love to protect themselves, even if it meant admitting they might soon be better at it than you were. "I had a good teacher," Sarah said modestly. "You had natural talent. I just pointed you in the right direction." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the sun sink toward the western mountains and listening to the evening sounds of their small domain. Cattle lowing in the distance, the whisper of wind through the cottonwoods, the gentle creak of the porch swing's chains. "Jack," Sarah said eventually, "do you think we'll have children?" The question caught him off guard, though he realized it shouldn't have. They'd been married for 2 months, and while their relationship had grown deeper and more intimate, they'd both been careful not to assume too much about the future. There were still shadows from both their pasts that needed time to heal, wounds that might never fully close. "Do you want children?" he asked carefully. "I think so. Someday. When we're both ready." Sarah turned to look at him, her green eyes serious. "But only if you want them too. I won't pressure you into anything you're not sure about." Jack found himself thinking about the kind of father he might be, given his history and the violence that had shaped so much of his adult life. Could a man who'd spent a decade killing other men really learn to nurture new life? Could someone with his past create a safe, stable home for innocent children? "I'd want to be a good father," he said slowly, "but I'm not sure I know how. My own father died when I was 12, and everything I learned about being a man, I learned in the army or hunting bounties. Not exactly ideal preparation for raising kids." "You're already a good man," Sarah said firmly. The rest we could figure out as we went along. Together? The word hung between them like a promise. Together. It was still a new concept for both of them. The idea that they didn't have to face life's challenges alone anymore. That they had someone to share both burdens and joys with. Maybe, Jack said finally, when we're more settled. When I'm sure I can provide for them properly. We don't have to decide tonight, Sarah said, taking his hand in hers. We have time. Time. Another luxury that neither of them had enjoyed much of in their previous lives. Time to heal, time to grow, time to build something lasting and meaningful together. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Jack found himself thinking about the strange journey that had brought them to this place. A year ago, he'd been a man driven by guilt and haunted by memories, hunting other men's sins in a futile attempt to atone for his own. Sarah had been trapped in a nightmare of exploitation and abuse, believing herself powerless to change her circumstances. Now they were building a life together based on mutual respect, shared dreams, and the hard-won knowledge that redemption was possible for anyone willing to fight for it. It wasn't the life either of them had planned, but it was proving to be exactly the life they needed. There's something I want to show you, Sarah said suddenly, rising from the swing with mysterious energy. What kind of something? Come on, you'll see. She led him around to the back of the house, where her vegetable garden flourished in neat rows despite the challenging desert conditions. But it wasn't the vegetables that had captured her attention. It was a small area near the garden's edge where she'd been working on a project she'd kept secret for the past month. Look, she said, pointing to a small wooden cross marking a patch of carefully tended earth. I planted rose bushes here. They should bloom in the spring. Jack stared at the modest memorial, understanding immediately what it represented. For your parents? For your parents, too. For everyone we've lost along the way. Sarah's voice was soft but steady. I thought it was time to give them a proper resting place, even if it's just in memory. Jack felt his throat tighten with emotion he hadn't expected. He'd never properly mourned his parents, or the friends he'd lost in the war, or even the men he'd been forced to kill in the line of duty. He'd simply carried their ghosts with him, letting guilt and regret weigh him down instead of finding a way to honor their memory and move forward. Thank you, he said quietly. That's perfect. Sarah moved closer, slipping her arm around his waist. I figured we couldn't really start building our future until we'd made peace with our past. They stood together in the gathering darkness, two people who'd found in each other the courage to stop running from their histories and start writing new chapters instead. The rose bushes were just saplings now, barely visible in the starlight, but by next spring they would bloom in celebration of life's ability to grow beautiful things from the darkest soil. I love you, Jack said suddenly, the words coming out more forcefully than he'd intended. Sarah turned in his arms, her face glowing with happiness. I love you too, more than I ever thought I could love anyone. They kissed under the desert stars, surrounded by the evidence of their shared commitment to building something lasting and meaningful together. It was a different kind of passion than the desperate gratitude that had first drawn them together. Deeper, more mature, grounded in genuine knowledge of each other's strengths and weaknesses. When they finally broke apart, Sarah rested her head against Jack's chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. Do you think we'll be happy? She asked. Really happy? For the rest of our lives? Jack considered the question, thinking about all the challenges that still lay ahead, the hard work of ranching, the unpredictability of weather and markets, the possibility of children and all the responsibilities that would bring. There would be difficulties, he knew, times when their love would be tested by circumstances beyond their control. But there would also be mornings like this one, when he woke up next to someone who believed in him and chose to share her life with him. There would be evenings spent planning their future, hands working together in the garden, quiet conversations on the front porch as they watched their small corner of the world flourish under their care. I think we'll build happiness, he said finally. Day by day, choice by choice. Together. Sarah smiled and pulled him toward the house where warm lamplight spilled through the windows, and their simple but comfortable home waited to shelter them through another night. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities, but tonight they had everything they needed: each other, a place to belong, and the hard-won wisdom that sometimes the best things in life came disguised as the worst. As they crossed the threshold into their home, Jack caught a glimpse of his reflection in the window glass. The face looking back at him was still weathered by hard years and marked by old sorrows, but there was something new there too. A peace that hadn't been there 6 months ago, a sense of belonging that he'd thought lost forever. He was no longer Jack Morrison, the bounty hunter, driven by guilt and haunted by the ghosts of his past. He was Jack Morrison, the rancher, the husband, the man who'd learned that redemption wasn't something you earned through suffering, but something you created through the daily choice to love and protect and build rather than hunt and destroy. It was, he thought, as Sarah's hand found his in the lamplight, a much better way to live. Outside, the desert wind whispered through the cottonwoods, carrying the scent of sage and the promise of rain. In the distance, coyotes called to their mates, and night-blooming flowers opened their petals to the stars. The world was the same dangerous, beautiful, unpredictable place it had always been. But Jack Morrison was no longer traveling through it alone. What an incredible journey we've witnessed. From a chance encounter in a grimy saloon to a love story that transformed two broken souls into something stronger together than they ever could have been apart. Jack and Sarah's story reminds us that sometimes the greatest acts of heroism aren't the grand gestures we see in legends, but the simple decision to stand up for what's right when everyone else is looking the other way. Their tale proves that redemption is always possible, no matter how dark your past or how hopeless your circumstances seem. Jack carried the weight of war and guilt for over a decade, convinced he'd lost the right to happiness or peace. Sarah endured 2 years of systematic cruelty, believing herself powerless to change her fate. But when they found each other, they discovered that healing doesn't require forgetting the past. It requires choosing to build something better in spite of it. This story also shows us that real love isn't just about romance and passion, though those have their place. Real love is about partnership, about two people choosing to face life's challenges together rather than alone. It's about seeing someone's potential even when they can't see it themselves, and having the courage to invest in their future, even when the outcome is uncertain. Have you ever witnessed an act of unexpected kindness that changed someone's life? Have you experienced the healing power of having someone believe in you when you'd stop believing in yourself? We'd love to hear your stories of second chances, of ordinary people who chose to do extraordinary things simply because it was the right thing to do. Drop a comment below and let us know where you're watching from tonight. Are you in a place where frontier justice still matters, where people look out for each other because that's what neighbors do? Or are you somewhere else entirely, dreaming of simpler times when right and wrong seem more clearly defined? Your stories of hope and healing inspire us to keep bringing you these tales of human resilience. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss our stories of redemption and renewal. Tomorrow brings another tale from the frontier, another reminder that even in the harshest circumstances, love and justice can prevail when good people refuse to stand by and do nothing. Until then, remember that sometimes the most important battles are fought not with weapons, but with the simple decision to care about someone else's welfare more than your own safety. In a world that often seems determined to divide us, these stories remind us of the power we all have to heal, to protect, and to transform both our own lives and the lives of those around us. Keep believing in second chances, and keep watching for opportunities to be someone else's unexpected hero. The world needs more people like Jack Morrison, not because of his skill with a gun, but because of his willingness to sacrifice his own comfort for another person's freedom. And remember, no matter how dark the night may seem, dawn always comes for those who have the courage to keep fighting for what's right.